welcome back to Broadway Drumming 101.
Thank you. Good to do a big part two. Hopefully it's big but succinct. and no, we get to some good topics because it's kind of endless, really. And you ask great questions.
So this will be broadcast, aired, streamed, whatever you want to call it nowadays, after your 11th opening of a Broadway musical. Tonight is, right now we're recording on December 9th of 2021, and Rich is opening a show called Company. And this is his 11th show, you said?
Yeah. And obviously, like I suppose the majority of people who have opened or are about to open a show this season, it's got all that extra meaning because we had done 9 previews and were scheduled to open on Stephen Sondheim's 90th birthday. So that would have been a huge event. And instead, it's a very, very bittersweet difference. And I would only say sweet because, of course, this tragedy of losing Sondheim is huge, but what an amazing life. And if you have to, have a long, incredible, fruitful life, he's a symbol of that. So it's a huge deal. And I've done a lot of Sondheim, and I might have mentioned it before, that I was lucky to do a bunch of his shows where he was very involved. This has a lot of meaning, and I'm excited. And as you and I just said, the pressure's off a little bit because all the critics have come, but tonight is just going to be fun. And then the reality of how much reviews matter is hovering in the air, but we'll see. It's gotten an incredible response so far. So there's that.
When I did Memphis years ago in 2009, when we opened, October 19th, I think. I remember
it's a long time ago.
Yes. I remember learning about how the business works and how that night the reviews would be coming out, and we had smartphones where we were able to read the reviews live. And I remember during intermission, some of the reviews would start coming out, and people were like, what'd they say? And near the end of the show, there would be more coming out. During our breaks, people would look at their phones, and they were pretty good. So we were like, oh, thank you.
Wow, but you were reading them during intermission of your opening night show.
Yes.
Are they still allowed to do that, or do they need to wait till after midnight? That must have been novel when you did it in 2009, that people could get them that quickly. Right.
Mm-hmm. And they would slowly drip them out. And there was I learned over the years, there was a website called Did He Like It? And it was basically a Ben Brantley kind of tribute thing where, did he like it and what were the reviews? And I remember just reading over the years how certain reviewers had so much power, like him and Frank Rich,
right,
and Charles Isherwood, and all these people from the New York Times. And if they didn't like your show, then that's it. But our show got a lukewarm response, like maybe 3 out of 4 liked it, and 1 was like, it's all right. But it didn't matter. We won the Tony Award the next year, and we, had our show started getting a lot of traction because the word of mouth spread and people liked what they saw, which is the same kind of thing that happened with Wicked.
Right.
People hated
I remember
it.
that too.
Reviewers hated it. And I looked back at the Did He Like It thing, and they were like, this is the worst thing ever, blank, 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 blank. But it's still running, and it's one of the biggest shows on Broadway.
Well, what do you attribute that to? And also, I think Beauty and the Beast, it might be easier to guess why Beauty and the Beast lasted 13 or 14 years and they closed it, even though they could have kept it running with not great reviews at best. That might be easier, but what do you attribute Memphis, that success?
That's a good question. I
It's
think,
tricky, right?
yeah, I think it was just like we've talked about. I think on the show previously on Broadway Drumming 101.
Yeah.
It's about storytelling, and it was a great story. And David Bryan wrote very catchy songs, and the show was really well made. I think I might have said this. I don't know if I said it to you or I said it to someone else, but when I'm in a show, I stand out in the audience or sit in the audience and watch the show. And when I saw it, I was like, man, this is a really good show. And when you have a really good product, people will tell their friends and tell their friends, and word of mouth is way more powerful, especially today, than any reviewer for the New York Times, New York Post, Daily News, or whatever New York centric thing there is, because their opinion doesn't really matter as much, especially nowadays with Twitter and Instagram and texting. People will get the word out.
There
Is
you
this
go.
good?
Well, yeah, that's really interesting because word of mouth means something different now than it did before social media. Because someone could say, word of mouth is only going to go so far as maybe the tri-state area. People are telling their friends it was a great show. That doesn't mean much to people in Des Moines who are thinking of how to spend a lot of money for their big trip to New York and what show to go to and what show to maybe take the kids to. So all of that, if all they have to go by are reviews, not even in the Times, but in back in the day, USA Today and radio and TV. But this is really interesting because now, let's say they don't rely on the New York Times outside of the tri-state area, but if it's word of mouth, they want to go by the press they've seen, or not the press, the social media, blogs, Facebook, friends they might have in the area. It's so fast. So that's a huge thing. And, I would have said some shows do rely on critics because they're not slam dunks for families. I would apply that to Company. Memphis sort of it was an unknown quantity that had music that once people realized what music was in it, it would be a huge seller, I guess, because of that appeal. And there was a story, right? It wasn't, correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't a jukebox musical. There was a story and an arc, right?
Correct. It was all original music and original story. So,
yeah. So, but wait, so social media back then, did that fit into a time where social media had an effect on Memphis? Because that's impressive if it just built that up. I mean, Wicked is one thing, and Beauty and the Beast is huge recognition from the movie.
mm-hmm.
But when a show like Memphis triumphs, and I guess the Tony Award does not hurt.
Yes, exactly.
Doesn't always help, but it does not hurt.
Yeah, we were like the producers were saying, like we were like the little engine that could. We just kept going and going and building and building, and people that came to see it, they told their friends, and it was we were very fortunate to have that show run for as long as it did, and I'm very thankful it did. And I hope the best for anyone that's doing a show now, like the same team that did Memphis is doing Diana. Now, nobody knows. I mean, people know the story, but people don't know the story of the musical, and they don't know the music because it's written by David Bryan again. And I haven't seen the whole thing yet. I've seen bits and pieces of it on the Netflix special, and it seems interesting to me. And I kind of know David Bryan's writing style, so he writes catchy songs. I don't know if he'll eventually get to a Andrew Lloyd Webber status by writing those earworms that people remember.
Right.
But who knows? And who knows what success that show will bring. I think they didn't get good reviews, and Mrs. Doubtfire didn't get good reviews. But is it a good show? Is it for families? Will people enjoy it? Like you said, it's a lot of money to spend. People know what Mrs. Doubtfire is, and they let's go see that because I know the movie.
Right.
So,
and it's a star-driven show, I would guess. or should I say lead driven, because Rob McClure is not a huge star, but he kind of has that star quality. He's an incredibly talented guy. And since it's always going to be like, well, is he like Robin Williams and that kind of thing? But you're right. There's the family appeal, the movie recognition, and then the other elements that, back to use the word that we used a lot in the last interview, a cog in the wheel. We're just the drummer, and from where we sit, it's just, well, we think the attitude is our drumming, makes or breaks the show. That's the kind of joke we have, is like, oh man, if you miss a couple of rim shots, the show's a failure. But beyond that mindset, we just realize we're at the mercy of all the things you and I just talked about, plus how much does it cost to run the show. If it's a really expensive show, you might really have to rely on awards and whatever the thing that makes a show a slam dunk. Back to when I did On the Town, that was an expensive show to do. And again, those producers bragged that they had a 28-piece orchestra. Now, I really want to emphasize for people listening who are wondering about controversies with minimums in pits, how big the orchestra is, that we're always struggling with the facts that a big orchestra costs a lot more money, but in the scheme of things with the budget of a show, it's not so huge. It might make or break things in a smaller way, but it is a little rough for us to always fight for if it's appropriate for a show to have a large orchestra. And they don't want to because they're saving money, but the cliche is, but they'll spend $5,000 on a pair of shoes in the costumes. So there are just so many elements, and it's stuff to talk about, to worry about, to joke about. And in the end, we go into our shows. We can joke that it could be the best scene, a great band, love playing the music, and that the show tanks. And then you could get into a show where maybe there's a lot of stress in the band. Maybe you don't like playing the music that much, and the show lasts for a decade. So in the end, it's kind of crazy. And it just brings us back to, are we enjoying the gig? Do we appreciate it for what it is? Right now, I hope the ironic cliche isn't true. And that is, I'm enjoying playing my show. It is classic music. The audiences are loving it. So I hope in spite of that, it lasts a while. It's a fun show, and we'll see, but I'm thrilled to be doing it.
So now that your show is open, what do you look for when hiring subs for your show?
Well, the first thing, and beyond the obvious basics of just someone who has shown in some way or another that they're comfortable playing shows. Ideally, that they've played something more or less at the level of Broadway. If they haven't actually done Broadway and subbed on other shows, they've done some tours. They know what it's like, because just being a great drummer is not going to put somebody on the top of the list. All the elements that you and I have talked about, and you've spoken about at length with your other guests, that are beyond just being a good drummer or even being a good versatile drummer, are key. You really have to be comfortable with the regimen and the way shows work. Even if you're not doing it night after night, you're looking for a sub who's comfortable in that situation, who's comfortable adjusting to different conductors, who knows the best processes for them to practice the show at home, so that when they come in, I can't say that I've ever memorized a show before I came in. I might might have had to, if I did a show where you're on stage. I think Paul Pizzuti talked about coming in for Larry Lilly on Million Dollar Quartet. Is that the name of it? Where you're on stage, there's no music, you got to play those tunes. But if you're not memorizing the show, you got to be really comfortable with those tunes, have them in your head. You've practiced it over and over again. I can say without a doubt, and I'm sure you would word it pretty much the same way when you're practicing it at home and you've got the setup just like the setup in the pit or wherever the drummer is playing. You practice it way beyond the point of you being sick of hearing those tunes. Because when you come in, for you want to be able to give the conductor, you want to watch the conductor so much for the times you need to adjust, and you will have to adjust. It is not something you can do with your eyes closed, even if you have the show memorized. There are all those elements of live playing. Things can change. Certainly in my show, there are subtle musical things that happen that, there's a reason why our show wouldn't be on click. The other side of that coin is you want to make sure your subs are comfortable enough with the show so that they're watching the conductor, so that the conductor knows musically and also psychologically that they have the drummer's attention. Because one of the reasons why subbing on Broadway as a drummer is arguably the most stressful thing I've ever done in my life is that the conductor wants the show to happen. Nothing against your own personality, your own reputation, wants to do the show as if they were closing their eyes and it was like the regular drummer was there. They want to hear everything so close to the way it normally is so that the conductor does not have to work any harder that night with you playing the drums than when the regular drummer is there. So it's musical because they want to hear it, but they also want to, when they're looking, now in my case and in many cases, the conductor's to see the drummer looks into a video monitor because you're separated. But if they look into that monitor every time, even if they're not adjusting and the drummer's face is locked in the music, you might luck out because you play the show great and exactly like the regular person. But I think conductors, and actually tell me what your experience has been, because conductors often will decide whether they, approve and then designate, which is designate as you're locked in and they consider you as good as the regular. When they know they have some sort of, connection with that drummer and the drummer is paying attention. There are great drummers who have had their own shows, built up the best of reputations, and not done so well with subbing because they didn't necessarily prepare the show to sound like the regular drummer, or they were not giving the conductor a certain level of attention that made the conductor comfortable that they had that line of communication.
There were times when I was subbing for Bill Lanham at Cats, and I made sure I looked at the conductor, because the interesting thing about myself, I come from the world where I memorize pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember memorizing Kiss Alive 2 and the Jacksons Live. I could play that stuff in my sleep. So, and coming from the world of playing live shows, I never really had music in front of me. So subbing for Buddy Williams at the first Color Purple, he said, "Man, you got to memorize the show." And I was like, okay. So I pretty much memorized it. So I paid attention to Linda Twine, who she had a metronome on her lap, and she's the only one that had it. She would go like this.
Oh, that's hard.
And and it's like, okay, can we have the feed for the metronome so you won't have to do this? But anyway, you have to make sure you're paying attention to her. and just keep your eyes on her. Because if she's going like this and you're going boom, 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 it's like, no, it's not going to work.
Right.
So
There,
with I think his name is William. He was the associate conductor for Cats, and he was there more than Christian Blodgett. But I'd always have my eye on him, and I had to memorize Cats, which is the reason why it's still stuck in my head. But
oh, condolences, I guess, would be the jokey response to that. But
Mr. Mustafali, oh man. But anyway,
but Cats has put a lot of people's kids through
that's right.
college.
That's correct. So yes, you have to keep your eye on the conductor as much as possible to make them feel comfortable. And he would look over at me just a glance, but I was there with him, and it made him feel comfortable.
Well, wait, let me ask you this. A good point. Now, you mentioned Cats, but you mentioned you memorized albums and you did concerts, but shows range from shows where you're kind of just playing tunes to I don't want to say older style musicals, because I'm sure there are plenty of new musicals that have incidental music and transitional music and things that need to you can memorize all of that, but you still need to be flexible. So
yes,
yeah, I think because I haven't done yeah, go ahead.
Even with Ain't Too Proud, there's a lot of vamps in that show, and we're doing
Oh really?
Tick, 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 tick. And the conductor is just waiting for the line to be said. And then it's like, and then you got to be right on it. I mean, it's like,
is that whole show on click though?
Yeah, it's on click. So you're still locked into the click. Then you got to pay attention to the music, and you got to watch the conductor and know what's coming next. Like you said earlier, subbing for a Broadway show for yourself and for myself is the most stressful thing I've ever. Well, I'll take that back. Going into family court was stressful.
Well, that makes even a better point about how stressful Broadway is. Yeah,
probably the second most stressful thing I've done. And
I remember, yeah. No, I was going to say that the show that I subbed on the longest, because it was there so long, was Beauty and the Beast. I subbed for John Redsecker, and the elements were. John was a great guy, easy to sub for in terms of being super fair about it. And the show was technically not difficult. However, the show was phrased in a very old school classical way. The different conductors on that show conducted differently, where the bass placed the beat in relation to the conductors, all these elements, and the fact that the bass was on the other side of the pit. You were on opposite ends. So there were a lot of challenges. And what would happen is I went in and subbed for him occasionally for a few months. And by the way, I remember when I was learning the show, John wanted to get me in a little earlier maybe than originally planned. So he said, can I come in and maybe between shows on a break, you play a little drums for me, and I'm going to stand on the podium and conduct a few songs as if I was the conductor. And I said, sure. I thought I was ready. I was at that point where I felt like I was tired of practicing those tunes, and I did it. And John said, there are a couple of these tunes you're not quite ready, and put a little bit of the fear of God in me. And then I think like a week or two later, I came in and subbed the first time. Michael Cossran, the conductor, is not a very expressive guy. I hope I'm not, I don't think I'm saying anything bad in terms of his face, what he would show. And I did well, but it was because the fear of God was put in me. And at that time, I think it was Beauty and the Beast famously, in the first of the two theaters they were in, had a little pulley system where you could send notes to people at different ends of the pits by putting a little note in a cup and pulling a string. And it might have been from my first time subbing, but somehow the conductor, Michael Cossran, got a note to me and said something nice. But having said that, I subbed on and off, depending on how busy I was, for 13 years. And it would kill me that I would come in, I might not have been on the show for a while, and I would go over the show, but I would always be nervous. I would be standing on the subway platform, and I would let it eat me up inside, partly because it was just sometimes hard to lock into the band on something as simple as like a waltz because of different elements. So it's a challenge. And it's frustrating to be so stressed out over something that technically is not that difficult.
I remember talking to Carter McLean years ago, and he told me about his first time attempting to sub at The Lion King. He learned the music. He's like, I'm ready. And Tommy Eggo said, because he, I guess, was also conducting
Right.
part-time. So Tommy Igo got up, just like in your situation, and started going over the show. I don't know how long into the process, but he was like, you're not ready yet. You're not ready. And Carter was like, what? So basically go back and practice. So he did, and he came back and he practiced, and eventually he wound up getting the show of The Lion King, the actual chair, but that, took a long time. But you might think you're ready, but you might not be. And I was going to ask you, what do you do as a chair holder to prepare your subs?
Good question. That was, while you were speaking, I thought that was an important element. We were talking about John Redsecker and Tommy Igo conducting it and going over it with you. That's kind of important because certainly if you've got a prospective sub coming in who hasn't done a lot of Broadway, you need to advise them and coach them on the things to look for. But even a seasoned player, you want to say, the pitfalls after you've had a chance to play it for however long, weeks, months, years, what the pitfalls might be in general with your show. And you also will be armed with some information if other subs have come in and have struggled with some things, and you go, oh, I never realized that would be the thing they'd have to worry about. But in general, if it's your chair, a couple of important things. One is mark your music appropriately. Now, that isn't to necessarily say overmark it. You don't want a lot of scribblings in and things that might only mean something to you. The great thing now, really great thing now, and as a matter of fact, tonight we expect to hopefully get a Conductor cam, a recording of the Conductor, which is a great device for subs. I think the best thing now, is the subs get a relatively virgin copy of the music. Let the subs watch the show. And as we all know, drum subs are going to watch the show more times than usually other instruments because of all the nuances you have to get. They're going to have their music, and they're hopefully going to have a recording of the show, maybe just the sound, but also a video recording of the Conductor. And I've found that I could decide to be really good with marking my book super specifically. But what I've tended to do is rely on my subs to mark their books, to give them some room to mark their books the way they would give themselves notes based on what they hear when they listen to you play the show. So, of course, mark the music so that they have the right measures and they know, because our show, like any show, has evolved during the preview period where changes were made up until a few days ago. And you just don't want to forget those couple of things that have changed since the sub might have heard the show, and then they come in and, missing a couple of measures or missing how a vamp plays out could be minor, or it could be kind of disastrous, as you know. So You want your book marked up appropriately. But what's going to happen is if you get your subs a fresh copy of the music with little to no markings, let them ask the questions. It is their homework to listen to something and go, I listened to this and it doesn't really go with what is on the page. They'll either ask you what you're doing, or they'll hear you play the show more than once because you might have changed it and figure out, oh yeah, there's a little play here. Rich does it differently, this subtly differently each show. I'm going to ask him, but maybe that's okay. Or this doesn't go with what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. Let them ask the questions. Keep a really good line of communication open with your subs. And back to your original question, I think subbing on Broadway is that step even further than hiring on Broadway. And we're at a point now where we want to get as much diversity in the pits as we do everywhere. However, the other element of making sure that the people who get those gigs have some sort of experience, that the experience counts. Let me put it that way. It's important because of how specific this type of gig is.
Have you ever hired someone that hasn't done Broadway musicals before as a sub?
No. That could happen, I guess. But I think that would be a rarity, and for good reason. And now this is not to say that there isn't a way to work your way up the ladder. And I would be the last person to say that just because I had a real slow climb from, community theater and all that stuff to dinner theater to bus and truck tours to bigger tours, all of that, you could make the leap much more quickly because of your ability and because of circumstance. That's fine. But when it's your responsibility as the chairholder to find subs, and if you're lucky in doing a show for 20 years and your pool of subs gets to be really deep and you're starting to give chances to people who might not be that seasoned because you figured out the way to make it fair for the conductor and for people to hear somebody that's going to do a good job. But you're picking your first few subs. First and foremost is you want somebody who's going to do the best job. And the easiest way to make that happen is to make sure that the person you have subbing has that experience. And if it's a catch-22 where they say, well, how do I get that experience? Well, you get that experience by subbing for somebody in community theater, in local theater, and you do a great job and the conductor says, hey, did a great job. Then we know this is it. I mean, there are some auditions now, but nobody's got an agent. This is all built on reputation. So to make a leap from not having done shows, now this, you asked, have I ever gotten anybody who never played Broadway before? I don't think so, but I wouldn't discount it. But I would not get anybody who hadn't done some sort of run of a show, a tour, or subbed a lot on something, because you need that some level of that experience.
Somebody comes to New York City. I want to play Broadway shows. I just graduated from Berkeley, from a conservatory in Iowa, wherever. That's all I want to do. I want to do what you guys are doing for a living. I have done stuff at my college, but I've never done anything outside of that. I'm here now. Rich, can I come watch you play? You're like, great. Can I sub for you now? What would you say?
I would say, Uh, if I had the time to put in to work with this person so that I would have a sense that they might do a great job. Now, let's put aside the fact, an element that we haven't mentioned, which is uh, you're not really the only person deciding who your subs are technically. Different contractors get involved at different levels. And I've thrown names out with contractors, and they've strongly suggested that I don't put them at the top of the list for whatever reason, or they've strongly recommended people that I don't even know. You have to factor that in. But you're making me think of something interesting, and that is I currently have a student who lives in Ottawa. I've never met him in person. He's actually coming to see the show company with his wife. He's in his early 30s. He's a member of the Canadian military band. He called me up to see if he could study. I said, sure, I like adult students. Turns out he's a badass drummer. He can play, he can swing. And I've heard him, I've seen videos, but he loves musical theater. And we've had the best time where I send him charts of shows that I've done or whatever, and he works on them and he records himself playing them. And clearly this guy has a grasp of what it takes to play shows. And he would be, if he came to New York, this is kind of an interesting thing because it's answering your question in a way that I guess is an exception to where my head would be at in terms of hiring a sub. And that is, if he told me now that he wanted to sub on company and he was moving to New York, the only reason why I wouldn't is because I have a few other people in line who are obvious candidates. But as far as somebody who I think could handle it, I would put him on my list, and how high up he would get on that list in terms of his ability could be pretty high. The only reason why he wouldn't might just be different circumstances that have nothing to do with the fact that I think he could handle it. So yes, and this also goes back to the discussions we have about there being a whole generation of people who are dying to play on Broadway and make a career out of it. So it's competitive. I hope we're at a point, or we're getting to a point, where any little kid, no matter their background, race, sexuality, all of that stuff should be like, you want to play on Broadway, go for it. If you're lucky, it can be fun. And you know what? I shouldn't say Broadway, because specifically that means you got to move to New York, and then you got to be one of the lucky 15 or 20 drummers who has a show. But touring, and I was just listening to some jazz legend talking about how tough touring is, because if you're doing one-nighters, it's a tough life and you're not really seeing the country or the world. But touring on Broadway, you and I talked about it. That's a once in a lifetime great experience you can have, unless you hate travel, because you're in each city for an extended period of time. You can explore a city. You also pay great dues in terms of learning how to play a show regularly. You can't sub out. If you love playing Broadway shows, you should be, without a doubt, open to the world of musical theater, which is Broadway, tours, regional theater. All the big cities have some great regional theaters, and great local musicians. So there's a world out there, and go for it, whether you wind up in New York or not.
When you have subs that come in, do you do the John Redsecker, Tommy Igoe thing, and not necessarily conduct, but are there in the pit with them and have them play your show, or are you not that hands-on?
I haven't been that hands-on, but that's been because, first of all, I don't know, excuse me, I don't know if John and or Tommy were either instructed or it was suggested to them that they do that, excuse me, that maybe their conductors recommended that because that was their MO, or because in their experience, they realized that it would be better that drummers got a little prep that way. But also, I was an unknown quantity to John Redsecker. I don't know how many other subs he had gone through, if he did it with the other ones, but I had subbed on Broadway before that. But I was still relatively new to the Broadway scene. The subs that I've hired, partly because they were shorter runs where I hadn't had a chance to go beyond 2 or 3 people. Almost, I've never done a show where I had more than 3 people who got a chance to play it. I'd rather give more work to a few people. It's kind of unfair to ask someone to go through the process of learning a show and then have them play it once, unless it just happens. The show closes. So the people I've hired were all seasoned enough Broadway people so that they knew, and you can also tell by the questions they ask, that they're preparing themselves properly. So I could see a scenario where, if I'm lucky, I'm in a long-running show and I've worked through 5+ people, and there's somebody who's shown that they could be a great sub but are a little greener. And I still don't know if I would get up on, well, I can't get up on the podium in my case. That would be tricky because we're remoted. But I don't know. Well, let me put it this way. Here's actually an easy bottom line. If you're doing that because you want to see for yourself how they play, okay, but with the Conductor videos now, that didn't apply necessarily to, I don't think, do you remember it to The Lion King? And it certainly didn't apply to Beauty and the Beast, where somebody goes home and for weeks they're practicing to a video of the Conductor. That's such a great tool. That has alleviated a lot of the tricky parts of breaking subs in.
I forgot the question I was going to. Speaking of subs,
Right.
how often do you take off of your show in order to get your subs in?
That's a pretty cut and dry situation for me, because I think the best rule for me, and how it's also obvious that it's best for everyone, is that break a couple of people in fairly soon so that you're covered. And in COVID times, even more importantly, break a couple of people in, because, things happen. Beyond that, I think a good barometer for the longevity of a show varies, but in our case, let's say that we'll get past reviews and the holiday season, and you have January and February, and then the next barometer would be making it to the Tony Awards. So let's say my mindset is, until the Tony Awards, I, first of all, can't afford to take off much right now, and I think that applies to a lot of people. If I'm getting other great gigs, fine. If I really need to take an extra day off, okay. But mostly I'm going to try to be there because I need to be. And therefore, I've talked to several people that I would like to have sub, but I've made it clear to them that I might be happy to get them booked, but to ask them to come in and watch, certainly more than once, is something that's going to be down the line, well into the spring. If I have 2 people that are available that have gotten approved and or designated and are eager. That's the other quality that I don't know if other people have mentioned this to you, Clayton, but something about when you talk to someone who's really confident and says, I'm there for you. I can get to the show within 30 minutes. That's another little element that's important. And I work my butt off to learn it, and they show enthusiasm. All that gives you peace of mind. It's still the proof's in the pudding once they play the show. But, if you're talking to someone and it takes some arm twisting to get them to sub, even if you want them to sub because they're so great, I think that affects my attitude. Does that affect yours? Like whether you're asking a sub and they go, maybe I'll learn it, or I'm not going to be that available, as opposed to the guys who say, yeah, bring it on and I will be available.
Well, I brought this up in another podcast that I had regarding sexism on Broadway, but this had to do with my situation at Memphis the musical. I was on stage in this 1950s Memphis, and we were in a juke joint. Therefore, the musicians on stage had to be black males, according to what was required in the. It wasn't really casting, but that's what they were looking for. So I was looking for black male drum subs. I was like, yeah, I can finally get all my boys to come in, all the people that I admire.
Right.
And then I'd ask them, they're like, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe. And I'm like, dude, this is a Broadway show. Yeah. But, some of them were interested. Some of them were not. Some I had to pull teeth to try to get them to learn the show. And I'm like, I just need black male subs. And then I was going down the list and nobody was really interested. It's funny how they're interested now, because not only because of the pandemic has brought a lot of hardship amongst many musicians, but they see that Broadway shows are a viable route to make an income, and it's fun, and the shows are much more interesting to play. But I don't think they knew that back then. So I had trouble finding black male subs. I eventually found them, but there were people that still wanted to play jazz, and some people that came in that were jazz musicians that tanked, and I was like, oh my God, it's so hard to do. But yeah, with Ain't Too Proud, I might have said this to you before, but I had around 75 people asking to sub for me. This is in 2019. And a friend of mine who's doing MJ, the Michael Jackson musical, he's starting to get a lot of people asking him to sub, or asking to sub for him. So There's a bigger pool of people out there now, and I could just, point my finger and find a sub that will sub for me at Ain't Too Proud. But I have way more people than I need right now, because I'm just like yourself. I'm not taking off as much, but I want to get them in as much as possible, just to get them in rotation, which is something that a lot of people, we haven't really talked about on this podcast, as far as doing a show. If you're a sub, if you put all of that work into it and you play the show and you're like, yes, I've done it. Then they ask you to come back 2 or 3 weeks later. You're like, oh, okay, I got it. I did a really good job last time. And you sometimes slack off. You're like, I did it before. I don't have to put that much work like I did before. And then you get in, then you mess up, and you're like, oh my God, it's just like the second, what's it called? Sophomore slump.
Yeah, right.
That's happened so many times. Then you go in the third time and you're good, and the fourth and fifth and sixth. Then you can start talking to the fellow pit musicians. At least that's my experience. You can kind of get comfortable as you get more comfortable with the show, but you have to get comfortable with it, because if you're doing it once a month, you're never really going to be comfortable. At least my experience. So it's something that a lot of people might not know, but when you're subbing a show, it's good to do it regularly. And if you're not doing it regularly, then maybe you should just practice it, because it's like you're second, I shouldn't call it like a second string quarterback, but when your star quarterback goes out, you just got to be ready to go in. And that might be your opportunity where you might take over for Tommy Igoe and wind up doing The Lion King forever.
Right. These are all the super complicated things about what we do. I certainly have had subs that say, I know the rule is that you can only book a sub once the first time, because if you've already gotten other dates and the conductor doesn't like them, it of course sucks to say, sorry, those dates are no longer good. However, they will say, can you get me in a second time fairly soon after my first time? Because you want that continuity. And this goes back to, for me, the only show that I did that I thought, it's pretty safe bet that, well, even then, that it would run long enough so that I could soon start to think about breaking in more than two people, let's say. Because Ain't Too Proud to Beg, I think that would be a safer bet. And even then, I don't know at what point into the run you thought, all right, we're comfortable for a while, forgetting about that little thing called COVID. But I did Cinderella, and I thought, this is a family show. And then even had to think, it's not the Walt Disney Cinderella. And Rodgers and Hammerstein, as famous as they are, people didn't know the songs from Cinderella, the TV show, which is what it was, like they knew the Disney movie. And even that's super old, but I guess that's more famous. So I thought Cinderella might last for a while, but man, I'm very hesitant to have a deep pool of subs who only get to play the show once. When I did Beauty and the Beast, John was really nice enough to, when I didn't have my own show and he knew that I was available, he would give me a bunch of dates, try to give me a chunk of time when he could. And I think his pool of subs was deep. But I would practice the show if I hadn't done it for a while. And if I hadn't done it for a couple of years, which was the case a few times, I'd say, can I come in and watch you do it? Because things change. And then I subbed for Larry Lilly on the producers. I might have mentioned this, or maybe not, but I subbed for him after I'd done the tour for 2 years. 2 years, I did the producers. I, of course, knew it in my sleep, but I watched him play it a couple of times after I'd come back from the tour, certainly because any drummer would know that just because you know the show and you learn it in a similar process to the way the Broadway drummer learned it. Same directors, same music, pretty much, but you got to come in, and I had to learn it the way Larry played it. And Larry's playing even evolved in a way that I had to adjust. And then there was the added element that the conductor was maybe, let's just say, a little mercurial. And what he thought was fine the first time I played it, then I came in after subbing for 8 or 9 times with other conductors that were subbing for him on Broadway. And then he came back and I played the show pretty much the way I had before. And it wasn't a disaster. There were no train wrecks, but I was not doing exactly what the conductor wanted to hear. That's a singular different story, but it's complicated, man. And there are a lot of elements, and on your show, you're getting all this great advice. But one of the pieces of all that advice are you do the best you can, you use your experience, and nothing is a given. It's a big machine. It all comes back to that being a big machine, and the show is your primary responsibility to make it so that you're doing your best to give your conductor, more than anybody else, the chance to relax and feel okay, that who you're bringing in is someone they're comfortable with. You're not there to make your friends happy. Lord knows we've all like wanted to give it to good friends who we like and or we think are great drummers, twice the drummer that you are yourself. I remember Buddy Williams calling me when he started doing Hello Dolly because I was on the short list of the Conductor. And Buddy's great. He called me up. He said, and I had really not met him. He said, man, I don't really know you. And I got to find some subs. And I got 5 guys that I would love to give this to, but the Conductor said I should call you. It was almost like, man, I don't really want you. I don't really know you, but could you come in and sub the show? And I was like, oh, thank you, man. That's really nice of you. I mean, of course, it made me feel good to know the Conductor had recommended me. But hey, it was fair enough for Buddy. See, that's the politics of what we do. Sometimes the Conductor or the contractor say, get so-and-so. Meanwhile, Buddy doesn't know me at all. And it's not even like my reputation is anything so great so that he go, oh, well, I can understand why they asked me to ask Rich. Plus, there's even the added element in his show that the star of the show was particularly happy to know that Buddy was playing the drums. And when he wasn't down there, if Bette Midler heard something slightly different, I think it was not uncommon for her to say, was Buddy out tonight and why? It's tricky, man. It's tricky.
I don't know all the politics of what happened at that show, but I know it was wasn't a good scene for the drummer who had to be let go and Buddy had to come in.
Oh, well, I think we can say that things happen, but here's an interesting thing that I think we can talk about, because Eric Poland has such a good reputation and is an excellent drummer, percussionist. He's now going to be the drummer on The Music Man. So things happen, and it puts the fear of God in all of us when a drummer with such a great reputation, for whatever reason, doesn't work out for a show. And many times it's for reasons beyond their abilities and the kind of person they are. Things just happen. But I think we can talk about it because, you know, it was awful for Eric or anybody to go through that. But when you're as great as he is, you're most likely going to land on your feet because everybody knows that he's a huge asset.
Have you ever been fired from a show? Let me just put it out there. I have.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But it was.
Have you spoken about it on your podcast, or is this the episode where you're going to reveal that story? Because look, it's important to talk about that. Failure is the best way we learn, and it's not even necessarily failure.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing with that. I wasn't fired for a performance that I did. It was basically there was a new conductor for a show, and they came in and got rid of all the previous subs because they wanted their subs to come in. So for a couple of years, I wasn't going to sub at that show, which was Rent. And I was subbing there since I don't know in the 2000s, early 2000s, and then the conductor came in. It's like everybody's got to go, and I was like, okay, you know, it's nothing personal against me, but I was kind of disappointed. But you know, I've been fired from other gigs too because of certain things that I did. I just wasn't the right person for that particular thing. But so
did that leave you with the desire to get better at what it was you thought was lacking, or did you leave it going, and you know, it sucks to be fired, but what they thought was lacking is just not who I am as a drummer, and I don't really have that much motivation to be better at that.
Yeah, it was basically that. And I realized that if you are a great musician and you're a good person, you'll land on your feet, or you'll land another gig where you never thought that this would be the thing that you'd be doing. Just like Eric. This happens in life with other kinds of jobs where it's like, man, you really wanted that job and then you didn't get it, or you got it and you got fired, and then something else came along that was better than what you were working towards. Just like what happened with me in the place that I'm in right now. I really wanted to go to this place in, I think it's called Parkchester in the Bronx. It's like I really wanted to live in that apartment complex. They're like, no, you're not gonna. We don't have any apartments for you. I was like, why? We don't have any apartments for you. Did you hear
Yeah.
what I said? I was like, but, and then I found out about this place, and it was being gut renovated, and I couldn't really envision things. 'Cause I'm not that kind of visual person where I could say, well, this can go here and that can go there. But my
Right.
kids were like, Dad, take this place. My girlfriend's like, take it, and I took it. And I don't, like we said before, I don't want to leave my apartment. I really don't. I really enjoy it. It's one of the better things that's happened to me. And you just never know what's going to come your way. Just be open to uh, whatever happens. And I don't want to say that things happen for a reason, but things happen, and you just take that experience and you just take inventory of what has happened, and then navigate accordingly. I guess that's kind of the best way I can explain it.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I think as long as you have good self-reflection and self-awareness, so that if you're not asked back to a gig, um, and you have enough self-awareness to know it's because you didn't take care of business, you could have been much better at what you did, and you don't dwell on bitterness because, hey, fuck those people who fired me, they're jerks anyway. That's a bad attitude that's obviously going to serve you badly. However, things happen, and it's not always easy because you're let go, let's say, and we're all we all have some level of a super fragile ego just by nature of what we do for a living. It's so, and it's very hard to explain to people who aren't in the arts, and you don't want to sound um, too self-important or whatever, to say, in the arts, our egos are perhaps a little more fragile because what we're offering is something that's a deeply personal reflection of who we are. You could be really skilled at what you do, but when it's artistic, oh, forgive me for sounding pretentious, but it's like the ultimate example are comedians. The joke is, there was a play, three guys, what is it? Three guys standing with their pants down. You're just exposing yourself, and you're making yourself vulnerable. So my point is that you have to deal with a fragile ego, but if you're let go and you know that there are so many other things in play, yes, you're right. You have to be confident that something else will come up, that people will recognize that you built a reputation. And yeah, don't let those experiences ruin it for you, because if you take a step back and you look at it in general and you go, yeah, I'm fired a lot and people seem to be turned off by me, that's one thing. But it's like, I've done pretty well. This didn't work out. I don't want to just point the finger and blame other people, because that's poisonous to anybody. And we've seen that a lot in our business, people who just are very quick to blame other people for their own career failures. But easier said than done. Have enough of an ego to not let those things stand in the way. If it's something you have to take stock of and get better at, fine, but also know that there are things that are political or that have nothing to do with you as a player, and move on. Yeah.
Before you go on, I'm going to put this recording on pause because I have to call back a place where I took my car this morning.
Ah,
Hold on one second. When it comes to being a drummer on a show, whether it's a long running show or if you're doing a series of shows over the past 20 years or so, um, our lives are, there could be an up and down wave to our life. There are times where we're gainfully employed for long periods of time. There are times where we're not, and we have to do many other things to survive. But certain people have had shows that have run a long time and have managed to carve out a life that is very similar to those that work a regular day job. I got to tell you that people don't realize that we get paid for 24 hours of work. It's really a part-time job legally, but we
right.
get full-time pay. We get paid pretty well, I got to tell you.
We do.
And we get benefits. We get health insurance and a pension. That's if we're working. All of that. But isn't that the case that happens when, especially nowadays, where very few things are stable? People's jobs aren't, you know, you can't just get up and say, well, I'm going to work for an accounting firm I can't remember who, but like, I'm going to work for Bear Stearns. You're like, okay, there is no Bear Stearns now because back in 2007, they went under, and you thought that you had a job that you're going to work
Right.
for the rest of your life, where you don't. And that whole idea of you just getting a job and working at that job forever, it just doesn't exist. So what we do is a job, and it's a very rewarding job, and it's not necessarily high profile. We were talking about this offline, but I just want to bring this into the conversation. When you talk about what you do for a living, how do people see what you do for a living? Do they pity you? They're like, oh, you know, that's cool, but you know, when you get a real job, give me a call.
Yeah. It is a weird dichotomy, if I can use that college term, but I think it's the right word. We were saying how, in one sense, they, unless somebody really has no clue about the arts in general, then at some level they'll be impressed because it's showbiz and you're playing drums. And it's funny, even as a drummer, people might have this thing about, oh, you bang on something and you're getting paid for it. Isn't that cute? But there are lots of levels with all of this, with being in the arts. But I think as far as perception to the public and even to our friends, I think a big determining factor is based on a sense of pop culture, and that just as actors have to deal with this all the time, it's the barometer is how big of a star are you? And unless you're in a high profile situation, well, that is how success is measured, as we all know, in a superficial way. If you're the drummer for Taylor Swift, you're a huge success, and you are. But that could be your only gig, and for whatever reason, before and after, you are anonymous in terms of the public. If you're a movie star and then suddenly you're not doing a lot of movies, they go, what happened to so-and-so? Boy, their career really tanked. And you have no idea. I don't know. I'm using actors because it's an easier way to illustrate this, but in a way, it's what we deal with. The actor might have done, as far as they're concerned, their most rewarding, their best work when they did a regional production of Death of a Salesman, but they were also in a minor Avengers character in an Avengers movie. And to most people, that's their barometer for success. For drummers or the musicians, if you're playing on Broadway, of course, people know what Broadway is. That's cool. But we're freelancers, and back to your specifically your question, there's a combination of maybe admiration that you've made your life doing what you really love and not what you feel like you have to do. Uh, and you might be respected. I've had so many college friends say, you know, you pursued your dreams and I really didn't, and I'm jealous. But there's also either a subtle or overt sense of, but I feel kind of sorry for you because it's a struggle. They know that even when I'm making a good living, and you said, you know, we make a good living and we're only working 24 hours a week, but you and I also both know that you can't judge what we do the same way a 9-to-5 job.
Right.
All the preparation we have to do, we have to be there, and what it took to get where we're at. And also, yeah, you tell someone what our yearly salary is, our yearly gross. Then you say, yeah, but if I were making that and living in Peoria, I'd be doing really well. But I live in New York,
Right.
and then I don't work much for 3 or 4 months. And it's hard to have a huge nest egg and save so that you don't worry about those times. So it's a real insecure life. So having said that, if you get to do what you and I do, and often enough, we have a level of satisfaction, I think, that we can be proud of, but other people perceive it still as like, I feel kind of sorry for you. Yeah, well, at this point, yeah, I mean, that's a cliche, but at this point in our lives, they know that's what we opted for. And yeah, I hate to say it, but there might be an element of pity from people that you kind of go, well, I don't have the time to explain everything that's involved, so that pity shouldn't. I haven't really thought this through to articulate it, but you know what I'm saying. It's like some people. It's hard to make people understand what it is you do in the arts. Here's the bottom line. It's difficult to make people understand what you do in the arts, whether it's music, acting, and even behind the scenes, creative work, or even working on crews. Of course, that's super important, but everything is measured by success, is measured by fame and visibility, and that's tricky in terms of how we navigate the way people think about us, if that's important to you.
When people ask me what I do for a living, I usually try to joke with them. I say, well, you know, right now, you know, those people that are in Times Square in the costumes, I'm the Pokemon, and they're like, they start laughing because that kind of throws them off, and like, oh, okay, really, what do you do? I say, well, I play drums for a Broadway show. And they're like, well, okay, which one?
Yeah.
Now, if you say I play drums for Diana the musical, they're like, Diana what? There's a Diana the musical? Or I play drums for, if you said I play drums for the Lion King, people are like, oh, that's cool. Because it's been around since 1996. But
wait, I'm going to interrupt. If you say you play drums for Hamilton, they think that you're more successful and better than if you play drums for, let's say, Diana.
That's correct. And you're doing the same thing. And who knows? Sammy could be getting paid more than Andres. I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly what's in their pit.
Exactly. We're in the same pool, more or less. Right. Yeah. Right.
So, but the thing that I've learned over the years, especially over the past couple of years since I started playing drums for the show Ain't Too Proud, and my guest plays drums for a show called Company with one of the greatest Broadway stars ever, Patti LuPone. There are a lot of other things that go into the production of a show. You have the stage manager. You have this assistant stage manager. You have the choreographer, which, by the way, the choreographers and the associate choreographers, they get paid a salary to get it started. but then when the show's running, I looked around one day. I was like, okay, what does this person do? There's a spotlight person. There's three of them, and they have a
Mm.
job in the theater. It's not like all they do is like all we do is bang on stuff. No, they point the spotlight at a certain point in time to illuminate people, and if they don't do it right, it has an impact on the show.
Yeah, it's a
And
performance, right?
and you have a sound person that's running the board in front of the house. You have people behind it, and making sure that the mics are right. You have a wardrobe department. Speaking of the cost of running things, we have so many suits for the Temptations. And then since the orchestra is on stage, the 17 of us, we have 17 suits plus the subs have their own suits, which cost money. And there's a whole wardrobe department. Then there's people that actually wash the clothes, the socks, and the underwear. And there's people that have to buy the soap and know how much it costs, and people that run and people that put on the costumes. And then there's people. Then of course you got the cast, you got their understudies, you got the dance captains, and you have the props department. Oh, what do you do for a show? I run. I put props up on the stage at a Broadway show. You mean you take something from a table,
Right.
put it on the floor, and you get paid for that? Yes, I get paid very well. In fact, my kids are going to college because of this particular gig, and I live in Montclair, New Jersey, and this is my house.
Yeah.
So the business of Broadway is very broad, and
There you go.
and
Yeah.
like we've said, we are cog in that wheel, and what we do for a living matters just as much as that prop person or that person who pushes a button and the scene and the backdrop comes down, or a person that pulls the rope and makes another scene come in, or someone that does the projections. We're just as important as every other piece there. And
Yeah. And all we can do is, like you might have had when you were a kid, offer ways to educate the public, whether it's talking to kids in schools or adults who don't know, some way, some reminder. It's not a given for them to understand what it is they're getting. Let's be specific with Broadway, a live show from beginning to end and what's involved. And if people stop to think about it on their own, they might get it, but still, all we can do to make people understand a little bit what it is that you and I do and props people do is somehow educate them and remind them, because always in the arts, in anything, the deeper someone has an understanding of what's involved, the better the chance there's going to be a broader way of enjoying and appreciating their experience. Let's use jazz as an example. There are elements of jazz that I personally think are very primal and people can enjoy. They don't have to be scared by like, oh, I don't understand it. I think there are things about it, just the sound of a walking bass could just strike somebody as being cool. But the more you understand it, the more you'll be able to enjoy it at different levels. So if we talk about Broadway, part of that thrill is when you know, and you're sitting there in the audience, and God, I hope there was a little extra level of appreciation after not having been able to go to a show for 20 months, that when you know, and you're sitting there in the audience, that from every moment, forget about all the prep before and after, you sit down, that overture starts, that there are 60 plus people making this shit happen all at once. And yes, we're a visual species. So the first thing we notice is what we see, and we're guided by stardom and who we're watching singing. But that experience, and what's going to make it a whole lot different than TV and movies or whatever, is when you know that those people are up there singing and acting, but in the pit or in a room somewhere, not because someone's pressing a button and playing a recording of a band, but it's live, it's live, it's live. And those props guys are doing that and doing their job. And the spotlight person, if they screw up, it's amazing. And all we can do is not take for granted that the audience knows all this, because if we do, then we're always fighting, all of us, with keeping the minimums in a band, giving the band, well, I'll be real selfish now. I still have a hard time when the band is, oh God, now I'm going to sound like a little bitter, but I think I speak for most musicians, because we're usually not seen. And I've been lucky to do the encores where I see what the difference is. We rarely get reviewed. Poor Mrs. Doubtfire with I'll mention the reviews weren't great, but they didn't mention the music at all in the review that I read in the Times. We constantly, the band is a taken for granted that they're going to do a good job, and they're almost never mentioned in a review. How long did we wait before our names were put in programs? And little things like when I'm on tour, or when you hear announcements and they say cast and crew, and they think they're covering everybody. So it's little things like that. And this does sound like I'm a little bitter because I'm singling out the band, but there are a lot of things taken for granted when you're in the arts, I think, because it's still measured by success and visibility when we're all important. And I don't know, I think, I'm guessing you and I and everybody else, in spite of what the overall public thinks, I'm partly doing this because I think it's a really cool thing that I admired from when I was a little kid. When I saw, oh God, I'm going to remember this name, and I thought of it because of the questions you posed. Joe Abeg was a kid in high school who was a really good drummer when I was in junior high, and I saw a production of West Side Story, and I couldn't believe, I knew the music by then, I couldn't believe that this was possible for kids a little older than me to play West Side Story. And okay, they're not on stage, they're not the stars, but man, what a cool thing. So yeah, we keep educating the public a little bit in overt ways and subtle ways so they know what's going on.
I don't know if I asked you this before, but what advice would you give to anyone that's interested in playing drums for Broadway musicals?
Well, I think you asked a version of that, but assuming the person's getting into it because they're enthusiastic about it, based on them having seen a lot of shows, or just they're curious about it. Okay, if it's just because you see it's a way to make a living playing your instrument. But I think it would just go back to what we always hear, which is take all those gigs, especially in the beginning of your career. Take them all, because you're always going to learn something new, even in the shitty experiences. No, especially in the shitty situations. You're going to learn something valuable. And if you've got a good attitude, even when you do have a bad experience, you might take something back with you where if you don't think of it right away and you're getting over what might have been bad about it, later on you go, yeah, but I learned A, B, or C. And knowing that is going to serve me well in the future. So you got to be all that dues paying. I can't think of anything that discounts the value of paying some dues, whether it's a traumatic experience on a gig that we all want to forget, or just minor things, little technical musical things or social things about how to get along with other musicians. It's all going to serve you well. And that's what you should be thinking about when you're going into it.
What kind of gear do you use? What kind of instruments do you use Certain kind of drums, certain kind of heads, certain kind of sticks,
There
cymbals.
we go. A big left turn to get technical here. But a good question. You know, my general philosophy, I've never been a super gearhead beyond the fact that when I was a kid, getting the drum catalogs was pretty exciting, and fantasizing about all the great pictures of drum sets and all the drum sets that I wanted to have that were out of my reach at a certain age. Beyond that, it's my philosophy has been drums are drums as long as they're well made. So I haven't been super picky about that. Hardware, I tend to go with simple is usually better, and I've found more convenient, and trying to reinvent the wheel with gear that might be good for someone's particular situation, but I get frustrated with when I'm on a gig and there's a rented kit and I get some sort of fancy ass drum stand that doesn't. You want to say something about that? Go ahead.
You mean the drum workshop hardware? Have you seen the DW hardware?
I have, but I think you were discussing that with someone else, maybe Paul again. I don't know that I can speak specifically to that, but I bet you if I gave some examples, you go, oh yeah, well, that's DW or some other company. Here's an example. And this is also personal, but the concept of having a hi-hat stand where the pedal serves as the third leg, it's like, I guess for certain reasons that might have worked, but I'm not a really heavy hitting player feet either. And every time I've used one of those, the hi-hat starts shaking and I'm going, well, what good does this do me? The three legs on a hi-hat stand is usually pretty good. And if the pedal can move a little bit within the, between the two, because you need to angle something, like I have a little trio gig I do in a tiny bar where there's barely enough room. All right, that's cool. But heavy stands, I'm thinking, all right, if I'm playing with Metallica, this is great, but I don't want to schlep this around. So it's all about, in the end, for drums, if they're well made, great. I've been using Pearl mostly, but if someone's renting me a DW or I have some Gretsch drums. I have a mixed breed setup. All of that's great, but hardware that's pretty simple makes sense. And then, like every good drummer, it all comes down to the cymbals. And when I was a kid, it's like, why do my drums sound like shit? But it's all because the cymbals are hard to get that you like. And when you find those cymbals, you stick with them. I think now if I had the money, I'd probably be buying more because I like what I hear. And certainly it's, for a long time, it hasn't been all about Zildjian. There are other options, but I have my favorite cymbals on, if you want to be specific and talk gear, I've had a 20-inch Istanbul with a couple of rivets that I've used on almost every show because it's a great all-around cymbal. I'll tape up the rivets if you don't want that sound, but sometimes there'll be one and you'll hear it just enough so that it doesn't get in the way, and I just like it. Fast crashes if I need that. A couple of good hybrid cymbals that serve good for a crash ride. A K from, I think, the 80s that I use that's 18 inches. And then I'll just throw in my little thing, my little personal pet peeve. Otherwise, I don't know what I'm contributing more to the discussion on this topic, is for splash cymbals. And because a lot of shows, I would say, man, almost every show I've done has a splash cymbal in it. And I never got into the sound of the little tiny ones that are 8 inches or whatever, because to me, they sound more like a novelty that was cool for, say, fusion or smooth jazz drummers with all these chops to have that extra sound. But I'm if I'm obsessed about anything, it's to try to sound authentic to the time. And all those cool choke sounds and splash cymbal sounds from the 20s and 30s, I think there were some tiny cymbals, but a lot of them were 14-inch cymbals, even bigger. And so I've been using this 14-inch Zilco hi-hat cymbal for a splash on every show I've done. This is all for drummers who like the minutia of it, but I used it, and it's on a lot of recordings for every show I've had as where I needed a splash.
I have a couple more questions. Outside of your show, are you working on any musical projects at the moment, or any other non-musical projects?
Well, yeah, I've been, and you mentioned it. Thank you for mentioning it at the very, very top of this. COVID being the mother of invention for many of us, I am doing my podcast, which is a little off the beaten path from a regular interview show, which I like, and we all like to talk, as you can see. So putting this down for posterity, talking to people about careers and stuff, is very cool. But I was inspired as I learned to record myself at the beginning of COVID and trying to figure out how I could combine that with talking to fellow musicians. And then I thought, I have this preponderance of bass player friends that I've made, not just in New York, but around the country when I toured. How can I combine all these things? Because I want to do something that's distinctive, that I'm personally interested in. So the short answer description of what I do, a podcast called Big Noise from Planet Earth, is I took very short, on average 2-minute snippets of me improvising on drums. I sent 5 of them to my guests, who for season 1 were all bassists. And I asked them to record over those snippets of me improvising, doing whatever the hell they wanted to. They could play as if they were playing a bass solo in a jazz situation, but they could play upright or electric. They could manipulate my recording. The sky was the limit. And partly what inspired me was that I could easily say that all my bass player friends, and some that I didn't know very well, all had very different personalities. And I was hoping that that would be reflected in what they did. They were not going to be listening to what each other did. It played out over a year, this podcast, this season. And it was a thrill. I interviewed them. It's a show where it's about an hour plus. We talk about careers, we talk about personal things, but amid that, we played back the duets that they created with me and talked about the process. And my goal was to have an interesting experiment with the creative mind and see how they all laid down tracks, whether they did it very spontaneously. One great guest of mine, John A. Baer, one of the great improvising jazz bassists in town, opted to not listen to my recordings first, to just turn them on, listen to a second or two, say, all right, he's playing brushes on this, and then just play over it. And then other guests listened to him several times and planned something out. And I got such an amazing variety. It was such a thrill. And I finished season 1, and I'm embarking on season 2. And I hope people listen. I've gotten a nice response. I'm asking different musicians, not who play one particular instrument, to lay down a third layer, which is interesting because it wasn't set up to be like a solo over a rhythm section. So it's kind of dense and it's challenging, but I'm about to interview the great guitarist in town named Pete McCann, who I worked with in the past in a band I had. And he sent me his newly created trios. And man, Clayton, it's just a thrill to listen to what these guys come up with based on these little improvs that I did, where I played a little bit of a groove and then started to play freely. And so anyway, that's been my one big musical project. And the other thing, which I haven't worked steadily for a little while, is I've written screenplays. So that's a whole other, oh God help me, a whole other podcast. But that was certainly a creative outlet I've had over the last couple of decades, on and off, especially periods where I wasn't gigging that much. And I am still shopping around a couple of those. They're feature films, so it's a huge challenge. One in particular being a big budget historical drama, but I believe in the project. I'm going to keep trying, but I've told people over and over again, I picked the one business that's the only business that's even crazier than the music business, which is movies. And I'll keep trying. I believe in them, but it takes a lot of energy.
Well, like you said, that's probably a whole other podcast. It could be part 3 of our interview, but we won't go too deep into it. But if someone says, "Yeah, I'm a best boy," or "I'm a gaffer," or "I'm a
right,"
forgot what they're called. The people that
grip. You want to talk about people? Well,
yeah, and
people behind the scenes.
I remember one of the first things I did in New York. My cousin is in the TV and film business, and I worked for the craft service department.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other section of the movie business.
That's a career. It can be a career. And yes. It can be, we don't know, but the major people who make movies happen, they might talk a lot about the food. The food that they got on the set helped make everything go better.
Yes.
Who knows? It's a huge machine, just like we were talking about Broadway before. So
writing a screenplay. Now, I don't know very much about it. Is it the script of the movie? Is that what the screenplay is?
Yes, but it's whether it's your original story or whether you've adapted it from a book, you're pretty much the germ of the whole project, beyond someone saying, wouldn't it be cool to make a movie about such and such? And sometimes that's the person who actually writes the screenplay, most of the time. And then sometimes it's not. But it's its own animal. It's different than certainly writing a book, a novel. It's different than writing a play. You're still writing for something that is eventually a visual experience mainly. So you think about movies you've seen that have very little dialogue. There's still a script. There's still a screenplay that you've written, but you do need to have a strong sense of story and a strong sense of visuals, because that's what the medium is. It's not a play that you can read as a piece of literature by itself. Even though plays are written, they're meant to be performed, it's still its own sort of art form as a literature. Screenwriting is still basically a means to an end, but if you're not an established person, and there's the catch-22 there, you have to write something really strong to catch someone's attention, who can make this happen, unless you're lucky enough and you wind up directing your own project. Something that someone's willing to risk millions of dollars on, and then be willing to know that no matter how many times you've rewritten, and you have to rewrite and rewrite, because you're never going to write a home run script the first time around, almost never. You've got to be willing to accept the fact that you've rewritten it 3 or 4 times. Let's say you're lucky and you get it optioned, maybe you sell it, and it's still going to be rewritten. And the story you wrote about life in New York City in the 1920s winds up being a movie about life in outer space, and your male lead becomes a female lead. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea.
Well, speaking of that, I was just thinking about this particular movie and I started looking it up. Screenplay for 2001, A Space Odyssey. You mean to tell me in that screenplay, 5 minutes of an astronaut floating through space? And I've only seen it maybe once, or I haven't even know if I've seen the whole thing. I don't think I got through the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's written in the script where, what do you say? A scene where a man is floating slowly backward from, the center of the screen. Is that how it's done? I mean,
that's the mystique of getting a movie from the germ of the idea to the screen. That's a tough one for most people to wrap their brain around. Again, especially for something that doesn't have a lot of dialogue. Specifically, that movie was based on a book by Arthur C. Clarke, a great sci-fi writer. Excuse me.
Stanley Kubrick. Yeah,
Stanley Kubrick.
He did the screenplay, play and directed it and produced it.
Yes, and look, there are exceptions, and he was already fairly established, but he famously has not made tons of movies for a guy who had a career for 50, 60, 70 years. God. And famously, if you had to cite one director who didn't have like a signature style, all his movies were totally different. And also the time that he came in, the movie business has evolved even more than the music business. And we all know how that's different. So it's kind of tough beyond just saying you have to be a good storyteller to generalize about how things get made. Screenwriting, I did it because I love movies, and in the late 80s, early 90s, indie films were a big deal. You could make a movie for less amount of money and tell a cool story, and people would go see it. And also, I have a brother who at that time was becoming a prominent or a busy production designer, which is pretty high up in the chain. There's the director, and then the next level with cinematographer or director of photography, and production designer that at that same level. So I got to read scripts before I knew how to write, before I owned a computer. I didn't know how to type. And I just thought, I'm going to tell stories. And I will throw this in to your podcast just because it's kind of funny. And I think a lot of drummers will chuckle. The first thing I wrote of the 4 screenplays that I've written was a story I made up about a New York drummer. You always write what you know, especially that first time around. A New York drummer who's a jazz drummer at heart, but playing Broadway shows. And after Tony Williams dies, he finds out that Tony Williams' famous 22-inch old K ride cymbal accidentally winds up in the hands of a country and Western drummer who doesn't know what he has. And I made up the story because I was so frustrated with all the movies made about musicians that just didn't feel honest. And all I could think of was that filmmakers, as always, feel like they have to make stuff up to make it interesting to an audience, when I thought if you tell a true story or something that's authentic, there's a way to tell it so that it's interesting. And I didn't want to tell the story about a musician and the jazz world that involved a brutal junkie who would beat his girlfriend, but he was a genius, or something super cliche. It's like, no, man, there are interesting things in my world. And why not tell something that's funny and fun? And then you're thinking, well, who the hell's going to go see a movie about a guy trying to get Tony Williams' old ride cymbal? But you tell a fun story. I made it a road trip where the drummer takes a woman who he likes, who's also in the current Broadway show he's playing in, and they go to a past convention in Nashville, and it's a wacky, fun road story. But if you are able to convey the passion and the mania that a drummer might have to get his hands on that ride cymbal that Tony played with Miles, you don't have to necessarily have an audience that knows those recordings or knows about drummers or certainly knows about ride cymbals. But if you get that sense in the story, it could be fun. It should be funny without making fun of the music, not necessarily. And I wrote a script and I did readings, and a bunch of drummers in town came to the reading. I got some great actors, and I did that. And I thought, well, maybe this isn't a lark. I thought I had a pretty good ear for dialogue, and I learned a lot. I hand wrote it. And then I had people I knew in Hollywood who were up and coming writers, and a married couple, and he's a director, and they thought it was a cool story. So I took it to a certain level. It kind of ended, but it was encouraging for me, and I kept writing. But it was kind of a cool story to put out there. Still would be if you do it right.
Well, I was just thinking of other movies that are somewhat music related. I don't think I've seen it. I'm just looking at it right now. A movie about people in a record store, even though I think it's more of a love story, but High Fidelity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can make a movie out of anything if it's done right.
Absolutely. It's all in the storytelling. If it's a human experience that we can all relate to, that's easy, you can do it. And then if it's something totally bizarre, I mean, there aren't a lot of examples like someone like Charlie Kaufman, who made his name mainly at first by writing the Being John Malkovich.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, if I use that as an example because on its face, you pitch that movie to somebody and they go, "What? You got to be kidding me!" And yet it's a memorable movie. And on top of that, you also have to accept the fact that you have to pitch something to someone, have them be willing to start a project that will cost millions of dollars, and accept the fact that you don't have to sell $500 million worth of tickets for it to be profitable. So the business end, we won't go into this now, but that's why it's even worse than the music business, because even a cheap movie now involves usually millions of dollars unless you find a way to do something super cheap. And anyway, it's a complicated thing, but at least for me, the bottom line was it was a real creative endeavor. I knew that if I was ever lucky and something did get produced, that as thrilling as that was, and Lord knows it could have changed and could be a stinker of a film, I'd still be honored that it was made. But I knew that the actual writing of it would be probably the most rewarding part of it, because especially when I made up a story, it really, put it this way, it really was able to make up for the fact when I was writing it at certain times, make up for the fact that I wasn't playing some of the music that I would have liked to have played because it was a slow time, and it filled in a void of me not playing some creative music because it was totally from my own head. or even when I adapted a novel, it was something that I really changed in a way that was my own take on this book. So anyway, it was a really creative endeavor. I would love to sell something, and I'm putting it out there, but that business is a whole other crazy, insane. Insert your adjective here.
Where can people find you if they want to find out more about you?
Okay, well, for my screenwriting endeavors, I do have just a way to put out there interest in my scripts, and that's actually, I do have a website, Rich Rosenzweig, at Weebly.com. Weebly is I don't know how big they are still, but they're a website provider. So it's weebly.com. And that has log lines, which are brief 1 or 2 sentence descriptions of what the story is. And then it has a synopsis of the screenplays I've written, and a few other things that would help somebody get in touch with me and give them an idea of what I've written. And then if you're asking me, and I'm grateful for it, if they want to listen to the podcast, I'm looking forward to putting out episode 1 of season 2, which will be out very early next year, where my first guest will be Pete McCann, the guitarist. But I do have 10 episodes out, all with bassists. And I will say proudly that what was so great about it is that you really can get a huge spectrum just with bassists of what careers have been like, and how each bassist, all of them are spectacular, have contributed musically to the same exact short drum pieces by me, which is a great way to illustrate their creative minds. So I think that has been probably the most exciting thing I've done during COVID. And that's called Big Noise from Planet Earth, and very easy to find. And like all podcasts, you don't necessarily have to download or sign up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Rich Rosenzweig.
Bingo.
Drummer for Company, podcast host of Big Noise from Planet Earth.
Yes, I will say, those of you who caught on, because I was just, I began interviewing bassists, I was inspired by an old novelty piece called Big Noise from Winnetka, which was a bass and drum duet from the 1930s. I think it was bassist, it was Ray Baduke and, this is bad, I should remember. I'll remember as soon as we sign off. But anyway, that was the inspiration for that title.
I'll put it in the show notes. Screenwriter, all around good person. He's going to be opening his 11th Broadway show this evening, December 9th. The show is called Company, with Patti LuPone and many other amazing musicians, cast and crew.
Yeah, right. Put it out there in the ether. Good karma. Everybody works so hard. We all know that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I'd like to see it. I don't know anything about it because I'm not the biggest Broadway historian. I should be, but I'm learning.
And yet I know everything about your show, God damn it. Because if you don't know about the Temptations, then you're from Mars. But anyway.
All right. I'd like to say thank you, but I have one. I always say this with every guest. I guess one more question.
Okay.
Are you watching, or have you watched Get Back?
Oh my God. Well, I even thought about, when we were going to talk some more about, this isn't a tangent. And yeah, we keep saying that's a whole other podcast. I will keep it super, super brief. But yeah, I watched it. I am a big Beatles fan. I am of the age where when they came on the scene, I was a little boy. I was 6 years old. And by the time they broke up, I was only 12, but huge impact, even though I went into jazz. And so I'm just saying this by starting out by saying that I am a big fan. Read a lot, seen a lot. The Get Back started out slow. It was tedious. It was seeing them go through a rehearsal procedure that,
Well,
I don't know for you, man, but
that's
like,
where I am now, and I'm like, oh my god, this has to be
oh,
good. I'm like,
all right.
this is awful.
All right, hold on. So I will
and,
say this, and then I won't. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
and I'm not the biggest Beatles fan. I like a lot of the music, and I find it very intriguing. But man, I'm an hour and 15 minutes into the first episode. I'm like, okay, Yoko Ono has got to go. I'm sorry. I don't know why what, how many people have their spouse at their rehearsal sessions, at their writing sessions? I don't know very many people that do, but then I see that Linda Eastman is there.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
okay.
She was there.
But then everybody's like, just stick with it, man, because when Billy Preston comes, it's good. Look, this podcast is going to be released after I finish watching it, so I might change my mind. But right now, I'm like, oh my god, can we get to the good part?
All right. I will try to like bottom line it for you here. If you are not a Beatles fan, I think you just watch it and see how you feel afterwards. That's one thing. What you just said that some friend said to you is what everybody's talking about. And that is, yes, you go through the tedium in the beginning. The Yoko thing is an aside that truly in the end is not a big deal. And you can't compare it to other things. The Beatles were so unique and hard to compare them to other situations because they were the first in a lot of ways. And these were guys who ate, slept, and drank together for, by then, 8 or 9 years. And John fell in love. She wasn't nearly as horrible as people wanted to make out afterwards because people thought they owned the Beatles and the Beatles owed them certain things. And John had this wife who was strange and all of that, but she was there. And you'll hear the comment that Paul makes later on. It's kind of like you get over that quickly. Musically, things do start to, after a rehearsal process, they're like, who the hell rehearses like that? It's so meandering. It's so whatever. If you appreciate them as songwriters and as musical personalities, and importantly, I all four of them, because Ringo, that's a whole other podcast. Yeah, by himself, without the Beatles, he would have been an okay bar drummer, but they are the quintessential example, however talented you think they are, and I do think they are talented, and they had talented people around them. They are more than the sum of their parts. And in the end, I love Ringo's drumming. I love how he evolved because he was part of the Beatles. And that sound of its time with the towel over his snare drum, and then eventually he puts the towel over his floor tom. And yes, he plays the same fill over and over again, but it's all contextual. And in that context, it's freaking awesome. And then they bring in Billy Preston, who is in some ways more of a musician than any of them. And you see their faces light up with, wow, he just made our tune sound so much better. That's not taking away from them. It's amazing to see it come together, pun intended. And then by the end, it becomes about the concert they do on the rooftop, which is kind of its own separate thing. So I'll just leave that there. And I'm going to throw in a little extra thing, which is I watched that. I loved it as a fan. I would love to hear what you think about it. And if you think about Ringo and talk about drummers who have not much technique, but somehow in the certain contexts, they made their contribution. I will say that yesterday I watched a documentary about Paul Motion that I've been wanting to watch for a while. I won't go into this because I know we're trying to wrap this up, but it was a great documentary, and he is also an incredible example. You may or may not be a fan. I am a big fan. And in the context of what he played and who he played with and what he did, it's a beautiful example of artistry that's about expression and about the music you play rather than technique and technical wizardry, which is always easy to love, and we see it on YouTube all the time, but it's the context of the music. And I was thinking of Ringo, and I was thinking of Paul Motion, and yeah, they were two great experiences. And I want to hear what you think about Get Back after you've seen it.
I'm going to get through it because a lot of my musician friends are like, yeah, you should watch it. And as far as somebody on my Facebook page talked about Ringo Starr, I believe that there are artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians that are extremely influential that may not be the best at what they do, but due to the time that they came out or their contributions were contributed to society and the way that they approached whatever they did, it changed things. Now, Ringo wasn't Billy Cobham or wasn't Elvin or wasn't Tony Williams, but millions of people were influenced by his style and his approach to the drums and his drum fills and his beats. And I was looking at something, I forgot what it was, but they were talking about when the Beatles came out and how aggressive they were playing back in the early 60s and how Ringo was just like bashing the drums, man. He can hit. Now, again, I'm not the biggest Ringo fan, but I'll tell you, I'm not the biggest Rolling Stones fan either. People are like, oh my God, you got to hear Exile on Main Street. It's the greatest rock and roll record ever. I'm like, I listen to it. I'm like, okay. And, even people say you got to listen to Kind of Blue. It's the greatest thing. Okay, it was cool. I get it. But I prefer other things. It's just my personal thing. But I understand why the Rolling Stones were influential. I understand why the Beatles were. I understand why Ringo Starr is. So I get it. You just have to. There are certain things that aren't for everybody, but
it's all subjective, right?
Yes, but I can step back and say, well, I can see why this is the way it is. So when it comes to the Beatles, one thing I am enjoying by watching Paul McCartney come up with the groove for Get Back and the melody for it. And even the long and winding road, he's starting to write it in the first episode. But I just wondered, why is it always Lennon and McCartney when I'm seeing McCartney write this? I guess Lennon comes in and writes the lyrics. I don't know what was the writing process.
No, they're real quickly. In this movie, it is a really good illustration of Paul being much more disciplined with let's rehearse. And he was working some of his tunes out more in the studio. By the way, as an aside, you never get to see that moment where Ringo goes from playing just a rock beat from Get Back to that little simple pattern he plays on the snare. And that's a very distinctive thing. It's possible that Paul suggested that because Paul played drums pretty well. I mean, not as good as Stevie Wonder, but Paul could play a beat. But John, not as aggressive in this movie as I thought he would be, but he worked his stuff out at home. They work out his tunes. But the truth is, it was never one wrote the lyrics and the other wrote the music. They each wrote their own tunes. And then when they went over them, the two of them would really be together and add to the other person's song. But it wasn't like one was the lyricist and one was the music guy. That was a thing that I always thought, well, which one wrote the music to this one? It was their tune. The exceptions were things like A Day in the Life, where Paul wrote the beginning and the end, and I'm sorry, John wrote the beginning and the end part of that, and Paul wrote the little interlude in the beginning. And yeah, after a while, you get to see what their personalities were like. Paul was much more influenced by old-timey music because he had it in his house growing up. John was more maybe influenced by old rock and roll and some folksier stuff. But I don't know. It's hard for me to talk like everybody to someone who's not quite old enough to have seen, excuse me, what they meant being the first at what they did. And I'll go back to Ringo, since this is a drum podcast, that you kind of, in the beginning, of course, especially you discover Buddy Rich and you're going, Ringo, well, he's just the luckiest guy on the planet. But aside from the obvious of saying the Beatles would have been weird if Billy Cobham was playing drums, or Mitch Mitchell, or John Bonham, Ringo was a lefty playing on a righty kit, so he had a certain feel. The way he played a backbeat, all those little things that, despite what Bernard Purdy will tell you, it's him playing drums. And I don't think I ever have to qualify it by saying, well, he kind of is mediocre or sucks. He's just lucky, but he's okay. I will give him that credit. He's part of that band's sound. I will personally say I don't get it as much with Charlie Watts. I appreciate the fact that he had a good beat and that he loved jazz and that he seemed like a wonderful guy, but I appreciate the Stones, but I'm not a fan the way I am with the Beatles.
Well, I'm a fan of our conversations, and
it's been awesome.
Yeah, we can do this over and over again. But we will wrap this extended remixed podcast up.
Oh God. Get the coffee pot brewing and get ready if you're going to get through all this, but I've had a blast.
Yeah, it was really nice talking to you and finally getting to meet you. And yeah, you're right across the street. Have a great opening night tonight, and we will see.
I haven't missed the downbeat, have I?
Is it 8:02?
It's a 6:00 show.
6:00. Wow.
Yeah, it's our opening night time. So I'm sure yours was you've forgotten because you've been doing your show for 10 years now.
We also 7 for some reason.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they started 7:15, 7:20.
Oh.
But is there an opening night party?
Yeah, there is. And of course, we've been tested a little extra just to attend that. And we'll see. It's kind of next door to you, I think, at Bond. Am I allowed to say? Well, of course, it's going to be, people aren't going to hear this until it's over. Yeah, there's an opening night party, and
okay.
You know, we're just thrilled to be there and get to play this classic music in a certain context, and lucky to be working with those people.
Well, enjoy. Hopefully you'll be running for 10 years.
I would be all for it.
Or however long it runs, 10, 15, 20, till you retire.
Yes, you and I will still be working across the street from each other, and we'll get our cup of tea and gum down our little biscuits when we're both geezers saying, can you believe we've been doing this show for, yeah.
You'll be in your 25th episode of your podcast. I will have interviewed 200. If I can interview 300 drummers, I'll be set.
Wow.
I don't think there are 300 Broadway drummers.
Well, you'd have to broaden it to tours and maybe the drummer. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I could. I mean, there's a lot of people that are doing this that have done it in the past. But 300, maybe that's a good goal. After 300, I'm going to retire.
Well, again, whatever your goal is, you're preserving something that's totally of value.
Well, thank you. All right, we will talk again. Rich Rosenzweig. Did I say it right?
Perfectly.
All right.
Perfectly. Craddock, like crash.
Yes.
Have you gotten that before? All right.
No, people don't really know Billy Crash Craddock. I don't really
Oh,
know. I don't really know too much about Billy Crash.
I don't know. I just know the name.
Yeah.
But it's Clayton. It's been a pleasure, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate the opportunity.
No problem. We will talk soon.
We will. We'll get a cup of coffee and all the best.
All right. Thank you.